Right, we continue our focus then on racism in schools. We're joined by author Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh and Barney Mokgatle, who took part in the 1976 protests in Soweto. Gentlemen, to both of you, good evening and thanks for your time tonight. Sizwe, perhaps let me begin with you. We've just played that clip of you taking part in a protest of sorts there. You've certainly been vocal over the years around racism, around what happened at one of your former schools, St. John's, if memory serves correct, and you've also been central in some of the protests that are taking place at Oxford when it comes to tearing down some of the statues that represent certain ideals. Now, when we talk about the issue of racism in South Africa's schools, to get it out of the way, how much of it is a race issue and where do we bring in the conversation of class?
Well, I think we've got a crisis of racism in former Model C and in many private schools. And I think that's a crisis that needs to be addressed dramatically. But if we silo racism from various other forms of oppression, which are entrenched by many of these schools' cultures, then we'll be solving one problem only to replace many others. And so I think the question of class and of economic oppression and the way it works in these schools and the hierarchies between, for example, cleaners, teachers, and students is crucial. But not just questions of class and race, but particularly questions of gender. In my old school, St. John's, a boys' school, these institutions can often become receptacles for patriarchal norms. And given the crises of gender-based violence, domestic violence, sexual abuse in our country, I think there are a wide range of conversations that need to happen about the way that these supposedly prestigious schools are in fact re-entrenching many of our country's social problems while they purport to be forwarding the education of a next generation.
So there's a multiplicity of issues then that would need to be dealt with almost simultaneously. Ndade Barney, let me bring you in here. As part of that generation of 76, I imagine that part of the reasons why you took to the streets was to ensure that there wouldn't be racism in any of the country's schools. When you look at what's happening and what young people are crying about today, does it surprise you at all?
Thank you very much, Cathy. Once again, we meet. Yes, we fought against racism and also racism at our schools. And what's happening now, it's hurting, because when we were fighting that time, we thought things would be better as soon as we get our freedom. But it looks like racism is still there. And I think sometimes racism comes from home. Unless their parents teach their youngsters that we are in a different dispensation at the moment. We are no longer under apartheid system. And also, at schools, I think racism and social cohesion should be taught. Because unless this thing is planted and really fed to the kids, they'll never change. Because as long as they are young, they've got to be nurtured, and they are like sponge. So they've got to be taught each and every time that racism is not right. Racism goes with capitalism. Racism, it's something which is really not wanted. Because remember that if you say you hate someone is a subhuman, which you're fighting against in June 16, you are saying you hate God, because we are all created in the image of God. So how can you say that you are better and somebody it's a subhuman? So I put upon the Department of Education and also the learners and all the teachers rather, but at home, the parents must teach their children about social cohesion, and I think we'll get somewhere. But unless we don't do that, then obviously we'll have fought for nothing.
The situation at schools, Ndade Barney, isn't just reflective, and it's not just confined to these schools that are being spoken about where learners have experienced incidents of racism. It's also what happens in everyday South African society. And to the extent that that has not changed then, I wonder, what are your reflections in terms of the country and its own ability to tear down some of the systematic racism which continues to oppress many black people?
Well, as I said, Cathy, racism unfortunately goes hand in hand with capitalism. But it's upon the government themselves to try and change the whole community, because racism at home, racism at work, racism in the street, because the other thing that we compromised a lot when we were at CODESA, and we thought that these people would understand that we were giving out a hand so that at least we can be together. But it looks like when we were negotiating at CODESA, instead of them taking that advantage and saying, these guys did not kill us, these guys did not send us through the ocean back to where we come from, but they are still welcoming us. Instead of them coming and sort of putting their hand out, they in turn, they are taking an advantage, because racism is still prevalent in South Africa. You go to the farm places, racism is there. You go to the streets, racism is there. You go to the restaurant, racism. But unless the government take a stand and they make sure that they pronounce racism as crime against humanity, we'll never get anywhere. We'll keep talking and talking and talking, we'll never get anywhere. So the government, it's upon them to make sure that they criminalize racism, because unless you criminalize something, we'll never get anywhere. Because most of our parents, most of our colleagues during 76, they died for this freedom. But what's happening? It's still perpetuated. It's even, they are doing it now with impunity, knowing that they'll never be arrested. So unless the government makes sure that all the sector in South Africa, that racism is abolished and it's supposed to be declared crime against humanity.
Sure. Sizwe, I wonder what you make, firstly, of the argument around which Ntate Barney is talking about, that part of the issue with racism is that it centers on the economic policy of the day, or the economic ideology of the day, and he's saying capitalism here seems to be the main problem, and also some of the things that ensure that the economies and the economies of these schools is perpetually sustained, and therefore even the racial groupings is sustained?
Well, I think in some respects educational institutions are a reflection of the society in which they find themselves, but we would also expect of educational institutions that they push against the harmful aspects of their societies. So I think what's crucial to bear in mind when we talk about the way that society links with the educational system is to also appreciate that because much of this discrimination is happening within a privatized sphere, or at least a sphere that is somewhat detached from governmental control, it's often very difficult for the state itself to regulate, particularly the private schools that are perpetuating this kind of discrimination and these toxic cultures. So I think one of the strategies, in addition to the strategies that have already been proposed from the governmental side, with which I agree, is intense pressure from the communities within these schools, from parents, from students who have stood up extremely bravely, and even the consideration of legal measures where discrimination is evident, to pressurize these institutions, not just to fall victim to broader societal problems, but to cut against those problems, which is what we expect of educational institutions in the first place.
And for those who argue, and I put this point to our first guest, Sizwe, who is an old girl at St. Mary's, to those who weigh in on the debate and say, well, technically, if you're going to a private school, or even sometimes a former Model C school, but I guess the argument there loses some of its substance, but you understand the culture of a school, and therefore you're deliberately subscribing to what it already stands for and what it already represents, and therefore the expectation may be a bit unfair.
Well, I think that would be to take a defeatist attitude and to suggest that just because a culture already exists, that it has a divine right to persist. I think the entire project here is to critique our society and to critique education institutions, and to ensure that no institution in South Africa becomes a bastion of oppression, and just because it happens to be detached from governmental authority can perpetuate apartheid under a new guise. I think it's also quite dangerous to suggest that black people should stay away from these institutions, because essentially what that means is that we continue with a policy of underground segregation. I think black people within these institutions have every right, having been denied access to these institutions for generations, to challenge them and to demand to be treated equally. And if anything, I think it's the people who practice discrimination who should be fleeing from these institutions.
Why do you think it's so hard to break this culture?
Well, I think we need to appreciate that after the democratic moment, I think there was a rearguard action in the private sphere in South Africa, in all those places that were separate from direct government control, to retain the same cultures that existed. And in many ways, these cultures are deeply ingrained, and unfortunately, they are entrenched by people with tremendous wealth and who are unprepared to consider change. And all too often, although black people are a majority, particularly in private schools, although black people are a majority in the country, they often end up being minorities within these enclaves of privilege, so that it's very difficult to generate the kind of critical mass you need for systemic change. But I think we're on the cusp of some kind of major transition, where because the demographics are slowly shifting in these institutions, you're seeing more people speak out. And I can only encourage the students who may be watching, who I think have played such an incredible role over the last months and years, to keep speaking out, because what you're doing is making a difference, and continue to challenge the teachers, the staff, the headmasters or headmistresses, and anyone who tells you that discrimination is a natural fact of your school.
Sure. We're going to pause it there for now. We'll continue our conversation with Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh and Barney Mokgatle after a quick look at your headlines tonight. The mutilated remains of a woman have been discovered in Eastrust outside Pretoria. A suspect believed to be her boyfriend is now on the run. Gauteng turns its focus on several problematic districts. Health MEC Bandile Masuku says they'll be drawing lessons from experiences in the mining sector. And the controversial Gabola Church says its congregants are drinking for deliverance. It's calling on government not to ban the sale of alcohol again. And in your sport, to fill the gap left by today's postponed Comrades Marathon, runner Kenneth Ramano completed his own version of the race, running a full 90 kilometers for charity. We're continuing our focus tonight on racism in schools. Thanks for staying with us. Author Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh being part of the conversation, and Barney Mokgatle, he was part of the 1976 protests in Soweto. Dade Barney, let me come back to you, and perhaps, you know, in many ways, the racism that we're seeing right now is just a continuum of what we've had in the past. What do you think are some of the other struggles that young people today continue to inherit from this country's history?
Yeah, the struggles which the students are still having today, which we are fighting against during our era. It was number one about school fees, and number two about racism. And when we're saying racism, because we were taught at different places. Now we said we wanted equal and free and quality education. And that did not mean that obviously we want to rush to the towns. Yes, it's anybody's prerogative, anybody's liberty to go and learn at private schools, at model city schools. But we're saying we want that better education. It should be brought back into our locations, because some of our parents don't have enough money to transport their children to school. So we want that education which have been taught in private schools to be brought into our locations, to be brought in the rural areas. So we say the children today, they are even trying to be kicked up in a manner that one couldn't understand, because they are trying to make life difficult for our young black kids at the private institutions, because the government did not come up with dry and cut regulations and rules that, look, as an institution in South Africa, you must reflect, you must be a mirror of the country, you must be a mirror of a free society. But they left it to the institution to run themselves. And this is why the institution nowadays, they make it hard for the black kids. They are pushing them in a way that the principal is not liable, or the dean is not liable to say that I chased them away. But they're making conditions to be very, very difficult. And unless, as I say, unless the government take a stance, a strict stance that, look, this institution must represent all the society, and also we're saying the government must also have a hand in terms of helping these children with funds, with school fees. Because I remember when we were in Nigeria, the government, they had this so-called liberation tax. So we are saying, why can't the government here institute education tax, so that at least our kids can have lower fees if they have to pay, but we wanted free education. But then the minds are there to contribute. This country has got money, and yet our children suffer. There are those brilliant kids who are very intelligent to go and qualify. There are kids who are trying to sort of come up to be entrepreneurs in the locations. But because there's no funding, there's nothing, they can't even go to school. They end up losing. Because I had a model with some of my comrades. We said, so that we can do away with this pass and fail line, we must, from that young age, from the preschool, from the primary, that we find the strength of a child, say, this one is good in maths, this one is good in nursing, this one is good in agriculture. Then it is in that way we know that our kids cannot fail. But as long as we still not show with the type of model for our kids, they keep failing. Because remember that our economy is based on a strong education system. Sure. So the government is upon them that let them try that. Even this institution, private institution, let them give a better quality to our children, and let them treat them better, not as if they are trying to change them out. Because sometimes you find that a school was full of white kids, but as soon as the black kids come in, suddenly it's empty. That school where there were white kids, now it's 100% black and 100% teachers. What happened? It looks like the white people are trying to run away from us. And they are in a black country. Why can they not adopt that they are in a black country? They must adapt to the situations in our country. Sure. So they must try and help. Those who have managed to go up, let them pull others up. So we're saying, parents, please, you white parents, please try and help even these young black children. And there must be those companies, even white companies, they must adopt children who don't have any money to go to help them, because our parents, obviously, they don't have enough money because of our economic system.
And you're raising such an important point, and Sizwe, perhaps let me wrap up with you tonight. The issue of inequality that perhaps has been exacerbated even more so by this COVID-19 pandemic that the country and of course the rest of the world is currently grappling with, and the extent to which, even some of the struggles that learners in your private schools may not necessarily be the same as those in your Model C schools, and would especially be different to those of learners in your no-fee schools, which just shows how unjust and unequal the system is in this country.
Well, I think we're caught in some ways between a rock and a hard place, because in the public schooling sector, we've got major crises that we have inherited from apartheid, but have also in some ways worsened around very basic questions of infrastructure, questions of the ability of teachers to convey the material and our pass rates. So there's a public infrastructure crisis, there's a crisis of education at the public level. And so in that case, many parents who can afford it try to flee from the public sector into a semi-private or a private sector. And then the problem there is that although some of the basics of the education system that are absent in the public sector are present, there are these toxic social cultures which cause predominantly black students to feel alienated. And so as a society across the board, from top to bottom, and from Limpopo to the Western Cape, we've got a problem of failing to create educational institutions which are appropriate for the needs of a new generation and can take our country forward, but can also make sure that people don't feel like outcasts in their own country. And I think going forward, that's the vision that we need to chart. We of course need a first-class education system, one in which the brilliance of South Africans can be demonstrated and can be channeled, but that brilliance can't emerge if people are constantly feeling like they can't breathe in the institution. And I think the global context not only reveals the inequalities that are inherent in this moment, but I think there's a very straight line that can be drawn with global struggles over racial inequality at the moment and the situation in South African schools, both in the public and the private sectors. And I think that's something that should give us all pause as we supposedly commemorate a moment where school-aged learners stood up against their government in 1976. All right.